I'd like to call to order the February 21st, 2008 Santa Barbara City Planning Commission meeting. Ms. Rodriguez, will you please call the roll?
Yes. Vice Chair Larson, absent. Commissioner Bartlett.
Here.
Commissioner Jacobs. Here. Commissioner Jostes.
Here.
Commissioner Thompson.
Here.
Commissioner White.
Here.
Chair Myers.
Here. Thank you. Ms. Ebel, are there any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items?
Yes, Chair Myers. The applicant involved with the 3230 State Street project has requested that the item be continued till April 17th. It is my understanding that the appellants are here to object to that request, and we will need to at least hear the appellant's viewpoint on that before we make a decision to continue or not.
I see.
We can do that right now, or because this is actually the first item following our preliminary items, we can discuss it at that point.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
How about announcements and appeals?
I do want to introduce Melissa Hetrick. She's our new environmental analyst, and she's with us today to get a look at how things work here, and has started yesterday. So I want to welcome her. And I don't have any new appeals to announce from last week. So just a reminder that on March 4th, there will be an appeal at City Council on your denial of the initiation of the general plan amendment and rezone for 1400 Rogers Court. Mr. Jostes has agreed to represent the commission at that hearing. Oh, you're right, February 26th. My apologies. And the other one that is coming up is also on March 4th, and that will be again before we meet the next time. And that's the 517 Chapala Street. So, right. And I know we have a representative for that as well. So that's. I also understand there's at least one student from UCSB here, and there are probably more. So, welcome them to the commission.
Right. We received an email from Francis Barrero, and it looks like he is joined by a number of environmental students. Welcome. Okay, at this time we will take comments from members of the public for anything that is not on our agenda. So if you have a comment that's on something that's not on the agenda, please fill out one of these slips and give it to staff. I have one here from Mr. Kahan. Mr. Kahan.
Yes, my name is James Kahan, and comment I brought up today at the luncheon meeting is a concern about projects being properly evaluated prior to coming here. I wanted to get it in the record, so hopefully there will be a follow-up on it. And there are a lot of projects that aren't looked at in great depth. They come to you, and I think it's doing an unfairness to the Planning Commission. As examples, you can look at the Union Oil project on Coast Village Road, which was considered by the ABR once in 2005. It was not a noticed hearing, and they really haven't reviewed the latest plans. That's coming up. You can look at other matters that have occurred. There's an appeal on 517 Chapala Street that really there was a conflict between the historic landmarks and the Planning Commission, and there were some problems there. That'll be addressed on an appeal. But if you got more complete input from the ABR and Historic Landmarks Commission, you could do better. The project, the T-Mobile thing, similar evaluation. I would say you shouldn't even act on these unless they've been approved by these underlying bodies. And then finally, St. Francis. And I think we've all heard about how it's been before the ABR since May of last year for 7 or 8 months. Well, they didn't really get to evaluate the project then and make their inputs. And I urge, it was considered by, I think, the Ordinance Committee last week, that you consider somehow getting this done so you can have all the information. You do not have time, I don't think, or I wouldn't want to spend the time on projects that have not really been brought to you at a more complete stage. Thank you for allowing me to take your time.
Thank you. Okay, I will close public comment for items that aren't on the agenda, and which brings us to our third item, which is a staff hearing officer appeal. It's an appeal by Tony Fisher of the application of T-Mobile for Thomas Thompson, 3230 State Street. As noted, this has been continued.
Well, we need, the applicant has requested continuance. The appellant is here to object. And so I would think we would open that discussion to the appellant to make his case, and then for the Planning Commission to make a decision on that basis.
Okay. Is the appellant ready to make a presentation? Mr. Fisher.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Fisher, and I'm here on behalf of Friends of Outer State Street, even though it doesn't say so on your agenda, despite my numerous attempts to get that correctly worded on the agenda. This project was once before scheduled before you. You had a site visit, and it got pulled from the agenda due to discovery of significant errors, a statement of fact in the staff report, and the staff pulled it. Those facts included the erroneous statement as to the legality of an existing storage shed on the site. The project has since been at several meetings of the ABR, and to say the least, the comments have been enlightening and colorful and derogatory of this project, including statements to the effect, if you can't lower that tower, which is what this is all about, if you can't lower that tower, this isn't getting past the ABR. And they have said over and over again they cannot lower the tower. What is technically before you is an appeal from a staff hearing officer decision granting a modification in a front yard to house the equipment for the tower. The design of that enclosure, which was approved by the staff hearing officer, is no longer being proposed by the applicant. They have changed that, and it is now a different design going to the ABR. Now, the request that was made that I saw was that the applicant had asked for an indefinite continuance of this project in order to do a total redesign. Well, if we're going to do a total redesign, then why not grant the appeal, deny the project, or have them withdraw it? I don't know why they didn't. So we don't have to continue to try and massage this somewhat contradictory procedure that when the applicant changes the design after it has been to the staff hearing officer, that it should automatically be grant the appeal and deny the project, because why are we continuing to talk about something that at all levels the applicant, the ABR, and the appellants agree that the project that has been submitted to you on appeal is no longer a viable or even an intended project? So why clutter your agenda? Why clutter our lives with a continuation of a project that, fortunately, I think, we appealed to keep it from being, I guess, rammed down the throats of the ABR, which is what would have been an attempt to happen, because they could have taken an erroneous staff hearing officer decision and mandated that as saying, staff hearing officer has approved it, now ABR, you have to approve it. So we've appealed to stop that from happening, and now we're in this odd world of dealing with a project that nobody's going to build, nobody wants to build, and yet it's going to be continued on your agenda to discuss what? A project we don't know. So granting this continuance, and you have been distributed now before you the pieces of paper that show the project as it looked like at the staff hearing officer, but you have to realize that the staff hearing officer, it also had all that other false misrepresentations of fact which were clearly known from the file. I didn't do any great discovery. I just read what the plan checker had written, and it said, this building is illegal. And then I look at the staff report and I see no mention of that. So at this point, why aren't we grant the appeal, deny the project, get rid of the illegal construction, and they can come in with a project if they can figure out how to deal with the fact that it can't be this tall on that building because you don't want it, ABR doesn't want it, and I don't think the applicant wants it. Actually, they said they're going to redesign, so obviously they don't want it.
Okay.
So continuing this to April just does nothing but other than confuse the process, and I don't know why staff or the applicant would want to do that.
Okay. Thank you. Can staff help us out a little bit here with the procedural?
Yeah. There are a couple of things that you can do. You can obviously choose to continue the item. We do have a practice both on appeals, both to the Planning Commission and to the City Council, of attempting to work out problems and get to a point where the appeal is no longer necessary, that the appeal can potentially be withdrawn, or that the project changes substantially enough that the appeal is no longer necessary. That is one thing we do. We generally do grant requests for continuances, but it is up to the Planning Commission to make that decision. It's one of the reasons that they chose the date of April 17th. I mean, they did originally request an indefinite continuance, and they modified that to a request for April 17th to allow them time to get back to the Architectural Board of Review. And since the ABR only meets every other week now, there needs to be at least some time for it to get to ABR. So you can choose to grant the continuance. You can choose to hear the appeal. You could also choose to grant a shorter continuance.
If we choose to hear the appeal and the T-Mobile applicant isn't present because of the insinuation that it was continued, what does that do?
I think I'll refer to
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman,
Knack.
if I could just jump in here. The applicant, T-Mobile, did know that the appeal was scheduled for today's hearing. They're fully aware of that. The appellant, who really, this is their hearing because they're the ones filing the appeal, so they really are entitled to a hearing today, have requested that you not continue it. So I think that it's up to the Planning Commission whether they want to grant the continuance or not, whether they want to, they should hear the appeal, give the appellant the opportunity to present the appeal, and then the Planning Commission can make the decision. I think that the applicant, T-Mobile, knowing it was on the agenda and knowing that it wasn't really up to staff to make that call, it's up to the Planning Commission to make that call as to whether it will or will not be continued, and knowing that there was an objection to continuance, could have been here. You know, I don't think that's probably your deciding factor.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, well, let me open up public opinion for this, public comment for this particular item. If anyone wishes to speak on this item, please step forward. Seeing none, I will close public comment and bring it back to the Commission. And Mr. Thompson has a comment.
I have a question, not a comment. Just for clarification, is it the appellant's position that they want to have their appeal heard today?
Yes, we've instructed our attorney to do
That's
that. He's done it, and he was even very careful when he first found out there would be a possible continuance, and you have a copy of the letter that Mr. Fisher sent out. He copied it to Steve Dunaway at SureSight, who's working for T-Mobile. This is and he was notified that there was an objection, as the attorney noted here. And what my problem is with the whole thing is that we in the Friends of Outer State Street have been paying Mr. Fisher for doing this. This was decided on October 24th. It was appealed after that. The hearing was set 2.5 months after that. Then we had a 6-week continuance after that. And as you can see from the two plans we sent out, are distributed, there are different dates. The Exhibit A's, they're different projects. And I think as Mr. Fisher so succinctly has said, it's a different project. They've essentially created a different project. We appealed something else. And really, I think they aren't here, the applicant, to put on a presentation, even though staff's been doing a pretty good job for them. And we can put on an opposition, as I pointed out, the antenna in the telecommunications facility, in the one description that I handed out, it's going to be 6 antennas. They say it's not visible, but it is visible. The tower they're going to put it in, and the 6 cabinets. And underneath that, there's a school.
Okay, well, why don't we get to the
Anyway, the lady-
discussion on whether or not
Yeah.
to,
Anyway,
and
the
then we'll get
lady
to the project.
in the school has protested this before, and there should be a letter in the file reflecting that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kahan. Okay, let me bring it back to the commission for discussion. He's asked it. So who would like to start off discussion for the commission? Mr. White?
Well, Mr. Chair, I don't want to start it either, but it's this is going to go back to ABR, right?
Yes, it is.
And they could go back with a reapplication in that time frame or not?
They would be going back with a revised application in response to the last to the comments from the ABR.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Mr. Justice? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Gatto.
Thank you, Chair Myers. I would just like to say that staff is not prepared to make a presentation today either. And from my perspective as a staff person, it's so customary that when someone in an appeal, applicant or appellant asks for continuance, that we grant it. That's why the applicants aren't here. I mean, you could say, yeah, they should have been here, but it's highly unusual that this sort of thing comes about. So, I just don't think it'd be fair to go forward today with staff not being prepared and the applicant not being here, and they're asked for continuance. A little bit more background. When this thing first came forward, T-Mobile thought it'd be a slam dunk. They didn't get their company architect to do the work, right? They got some draftsperson or something like that to do the work. And, it went forward, and ABR had some problems with it. Mostly, my understanding is mostly they didn't have problems with the part that the appeal is dealing with, which is this kind of equipment enclosure and trash enclosure in the back. They have this problem with a big, like a tower on the front of the building or in the middle of the building, which is not, that's not part of the appeal. That doesn't have an encroachment. That doesn't need a modification. So anyway, 2 weeks ago, or a week ago yesterday, I guess, the project went to the ABR. They didn't like what they saw. And so T-Mobile has brought in their company architect to work on the whole thing. And he wanted to have time to look at the whole project. He didn't want to do it piecemeal. We don't like to do it piecemeal. The Planning Commission traditionally doesn't like to do things piecemeal either. So we're saying, let's take a time out. Let's look at the whole thing. From my understanding, the trash enclosure that was approved by the staff hearing officer and what we're looking at now is substantially the same. It's an encroachment into the High Alamo front setback, and so there wasn't a whole lot of comment on that except for a little bit, but it needs to be worked out. I highly recommend, strongly recommend, I guess would be the right word, that you continue this project till whatever date, April 17th. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Justice?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just speaking to the procedural issues, I'm sensitive to the comments that Mr. Fisher raised in terms of they are the appellants, and here all of a sudden they have paid their appellant fees and tried to bring this up so that we could make the judgment call on it. And with the changes in the project description and the plan circulating around, it's a moving target. And so I'm not sure that we're going to be able to deal with this today if staff is not prepared to discuss the matter. So I understand that, but I think we've got to be able to hear the project as soon as practical and not have the appellant and the appellant's attorney spinning their wheels trying to get a decision out of us and having things change all the time. So I think it's important to recognize and acknowledge that the appellant has raised some very, very legitimate concerns here.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. Ms. Jacobs? Is it Ms. Jacobs? Yeah. I'm sorry.
I have a question for staff. Is the proposed continuance date the earliest one available?
No, it is not. I mean, it was to allow the time for the applicant to do a redesign and go back to the Architectural Board of Review.
I'm sympathetic to the appellant, as Mr. Justice has outlined, and it seems very unfair for the appellant to have to continue to make their calendar and their attorney and their fees available, and I would regret having to make them wait much longer. Clearly, the option is available to us today to hold a hearing. However, we don't have all the information in front of us, and that makes it difficult to make a responsible decision.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, my point also, and the reason that I asked the appellant the question is it's their call, and they want to have their hearing, and as far as I'm concerned, procedurally, we have the hearing. I think we're going to find that there's some issues with the project that could be changed, that we might require to be changed, and it sounds like the project proponent is making changes as we speak, so at some point the changes are going to nullify whatever approval the staff hearing officer approved in the first place. So, you know, it's almost like an academic discussion here, but if the appellant wants the hearing, I think we should have the hearing and do the best we can with what we have today.
Mr. Justice, did you have?
No other comment.
Okay. Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, the project has continued to change. I mean, it's been around a long time. I recall seeing it over 2 years ago when I was chairing the Architectural Board of Review, so it's been in the process quite some time. What I have seen, though, in all the iterations is that the rear portion of the project, which is encroaching into the front yard setback on Calle Alamo, that has never changed, and that's the basis upon which the appeal is filed. So I think that we should go ahead and listen to this.
Well, I would actually respond. That's not the only basis, because
Right.
the staff hearing officer did originally approve a modification on the State Street side as well, and the appeal was based on what the staff hearing officer approved.
Right, but the iterations that we've seen all have the encroachment at the rear, which is one of the bases upon which they're appealing the project, and that's not changing even with this latest version that we've seen, and it continues to change. So I think that the appeal is still valid, and I think that we should go ahead with it.
Thank you. Well, it looks like it's the pleasure of the commission to continue with the appeal.
To hear the appeal
To
today,
hear the
then
appeal today.
I would request, in order to have at least some of the appropriate staff here for this, that we hold this hearing after the Plaza de la Guerra discussion, so that they can have the appropriate staff present.
Okay.
And we need to confirm that that's acceptable to the appellants.
Yeah,
Mr.
we
Kahan?
wouldn't have any problem with that. We would ask for a time certain so we don't have to wait around here for 2 hours. What do you estimate the next hearing will take?
Turn around, Mr. Kahan. You can draw your own conclusions.
Yes. When I act as a judge in court, as a pro tem judge, I ask the question, who's here, how many people are here, and you try to keep the minimum number of people waiting. We're happy to accommodate you. And I would just guess from looking at that, we shouldn't be back here till approximately 3:30. And it'll give them enough time to do it.
I think that's appropriate. Yeah.
I'm sorry to miss Mr. Capello's arguments, because they're the best I've probably heard in any court. And I'm certain you will be charmed today and learn something from
Well,
it.
thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you after 3:30 then.
Okay, so we'll move item number 3 to the end of the agenda.
Really?
Okay.
Just to move to hear it today,
Really? Yes.
I move that we continue this matter to later in our agenda this afternoon, hoping to reach it on or after 3:30 this afternoon to follow this current agenda item.
Second?
First and a second by Ms. Jacobs. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none. Motion carries. Let's hope it's not appealable. Okay, our next item is a discussion item. It's the application of the City of Santa Barbara Redevelopment Agency, Plaza de la Guerra. Staff presentation to be given by Heather Baker.
Chair Myers, we would request that because there's a lot of project description from the applicant, that maybe we hear that project description first so that then the staff can concentrate more on sort of the planning issues related to that.
Okay, sounds good. Is the applicant ready for? Okay. Thank you.
Testing. Hello? Testing.
You ready?
Hello?
Yeah. Okay. If you could identify yourself and your team for the record, please.
Thank you. My name is Mark Aguilar, Redevelopment Specialist with the City's Redevelopment Agency. Today I'll be joined by the firm of Campbell & Campbell, Doug Campbell, American Institute of Certified Planners, and American Society of Landscape Architects, and Regula Campbell.
Sounds on. It's on. It's on. Maybe bring it a little closer.
Sure.
Thanks.
I'm joined today by the firm of Campbell & Campbell with Doug Campbell, American Institute of Certified Planners, and American Society of Landscape Architects. Regula Campbell, American Institute of Architects, and accompanying them is Derek Rapp, engineer with... That sounds good. How about now? All right.
Great.
Sorry about all that.
Thank you.
Well, my name is still Mark Aguilar. I'm a redevelopment specialist with the city's redevelopment agency. I'm joined by the design team of Campbell & Campbell, Doug Campbell, American Institute of Certified Planners, and American Society of Landscape Architects, Regula Campbell, American Institute of Architects, and assisting them with this is Derek Rapp, engineer with Penfield & Smith. I'll be providing a little bit of background to the project, then yield the floor to the Campbells for their presentation on the design elements, and then I'll wrap up with some closing words on where we're going with this project. A bit of background. As observed in the planning staff report, options for improving the plaza have been around for a number of decades, but without significant change occurring. This most recent effort, which we have today, had its roots in the 1990s, with specific council direction in late 2004 to develop and bring forward a concept plan for the plaza. We began with a fix-it list of infrastructure improvements, and the design team of Campbell & Campbell was enlisted to develop a design adhering to council's direction. It was found, however, that because of the interplay of individual elements, that some additional direction was needed in order to determine priority. And we visited the council and discussed the following fix-its. There we go. First was to replace the sidewalks, install some ramps, and provide parking to meet ADA standards. relocate electrical service structure, which is in the center of the plaza with the striped tent over it, upgrade electric power capacity, and this was primarily to serve the major community events that occur there regularly now, improve the landscaping, replace, upgrade the pedestrian amenities such as benches, trash and recycling containers, and the like. Provide a trash and recycling enclosure, and this came out of many meetings prior in the 90s, and the idea was that the trash recycling enclosure would serve a lot of the adjacent businesses that are kind of strapped for space. Additionally, and they were very careful to craft this language, design the roadway and interior lawn to function in a safe manner for vehicles and pedestrians during large community events, improve the stormwater system, improve the vehicle and pedestrian signage, and also improve the connectivity or the connection of the plaza to Casa de la Guerra with raised crosswalks or distinctive materials. In November 2006, Council was presented with with several design iterations ranging from basic repair and replacement with no change to the parking whatsoever, all the way through to sidewalk and roadway widening with removal of some parking. The hearing concluded with Council directing staff to return with a comprehensive plan for plaza improvements, which ultimately brings us here today. The process thus far has been to open a dialogue and obtain early input from the committees, commissions, and public on potential elements of a comprehensive design. We have visited the Downtown Organization, the Downtown Parking Committee, Historic Landmarks Commission, Park and Recreation Commission, Transportation and Circulation Committee, and we've held a meeting with the public in the library downtown. Well, we learned a couple of things that, well, we pretty much already knew. One was the community has a very deep interest and strong concern about any changes proposed for the plaza, and opinions range from leave it as is but make needed repairs to let's change some things, let's consider some other improvements. Clearly there are trends of concern which have focused primarily on parking, changes to it or loss of parking, changes in circulation, pedestrian but primarily vehicle, and history and cultural resources. Cost, maintenance, aesthetics and amenities have all been raised as issues of concern, but they're a step back from parking, circulation, and historic resources. The ideas and suggestions that we receive will be considered before a concept design is brought or is presented to council for the decision on what elements should be included in the project. This will be accompanied by an engineer's estimate of potential costs in order to help council make that decision. When the project is determined, it will be taken through a public design review and environmental review process where it can be expected to evolve much further. A general clarification that I'd like to make is that there's been some discussion about how potential closing of State Street relates to this project, and I just want it to be on record that this project does not and has not proposed closure of either State Street or De La Guerra Street in any way. Possible changes to circulation on East De La Guerra Street have been considered, and therefore indirectly some changes to circulation on State Street, but closure has never been an element of this project. I'd like to now pass the floor to Campbell & Campbell to provide us with a tour of the potential design elements offered for discussion.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Doug Campbell, landscape architect. With me is my partner, Regula Campbell, and our associate, Derek Rapp. As Mark said, this is a concept. It is actually a pre-concept, a diagram, which has evolved in conversations with the city staff, members of the public, up through last September. This is, as Mark said, also the presentation that we have made to the various groups since September, and has not yet at this point incorporated any of the comments, any of the suggestions or analysis that has been suggested in those meetings. So you all are seeing the same presentation effectively that has been given since September, seeking reaction and input, which, as Mark indicated, would all be then analyzed and would result in in a further conceptual information. Also, as Mark said, the idea here is to refresh ourselves as to the current conditions of the area, including State Street corridor, Stork Placida, De La Guerra itself, and the surrounding areas, including De La Guerra Street. It also serves to remind us not only do we have infrastructure, circulation, and connectivity concerns, if you will, but also that De La Guerra represents an extremely, if not the most significant public place in the city. It is the civic heart of Santa Barbara, intended as such explicitly in the 1853 gift by the De La Guerra family, and also explicitly intended to be a, quote, plaza in the European mode, a place for civic discourse and gathering, celebration of all kinds. I think it's extremely important that we're mindful of this fact that this is explicitly a civic place, explicitly was intended as a civic place that has gone through evolution and iteration to its present condition, but in many ways can be understood as not ever having really been completed. We can go into that later, but the current condition serves really as an accretion of things that have happened over time and not any sense of the original design intent. Further moving through the site, I think it's important to take a look at this aspect, especially from State Street, from the State Street sidewalks, through the Stork Placita area toward De La Guerra Plaza. As we know, the State Street corridor serves, you can argue the numbers, maybe 1 million visitors, pedestrian a year, a tremendous amount of feet on the sidewalk. The Placita De La Guerra Plaza receives very little of that. We believe that these issues of linkage, so-called connectivity, just accessibility and understanding of what's there, both by locals and visitors alike, is really problematic. The view through Stork Placida appears to be as essentially a parking lot. Further, once one enters the plaza from the south, it's clear to see that the plaza in many ways has become, in fact, a de facto parking lot. Now, as far as infrastructure is concerned, we're back again to some extremely problematic conditions at this point. Regula, would you like to talk about those a little bit?
As with any project, one of our initial tasks is to go out and look at the existing conditions. And this we did ourselves, of course, and we have over our participation just in events and as volunteers for various festivals in De La Guerra Plaza. But we also walked the site, of course, with our parking and traffic consultant from Penfield and Smith, with representatives of the City Fire Department and Police Department, and with Marshall Rose of the Downtown Organization. And these are just some of the findings. Of course, the condition of the sidewalk varies. In some places, it's been cracked and repaired many times. On the right-hand side, you'll see the sidewalk in front of the Casa de la Guerra with its rather high curb, and often cars will scrape their doors along the sidewalk. And the very narrow sidewalk on the western edge of the plaza running along the front of the patios of the restaurants that also face on State Street. And you can see part of the problems of the trash and recycling containers that was brought up in the initial city council directives. And of course, during events in the plaza, these shots taken during the Mercado, during Old Spanish Days, and you can see the Old Spanish Days booth on the right-hand side of the slide, El Mayo's Carnitas, and you can see the condition of how they relate to the dreaded agapanthus planting there in the plaza. And and on the left, while the booths are being initially set up, and on the right, during the Mercado itself. There's also problems with setting up the booths, as we've known and participated as volunteers in setting them up, of shimming them, et cetera, because of the curb condition and how they sit along those curbs. There's also problems during these festivals, as noted by the City Council, of the infrastructure utilities brought to these booths. And you can see the electrical wires here. Not pretty, and the gas lines and water lines, et cetera. So there are problems with these. And the structure, the tent-like structure in the center covering the electrical service to the plaza for events and unsightly intrusion into the plaza. Note the edge of the existing palm trees and the light fixtures, and that'll give you a sense when you see later slides of where that curb edge as it exists now. And the collection of street furniture within the plaza is not really up to city standards and found other places in the downtown area, and it varies greatly from place to place. And here again, a shot looking from the plaza, from the western edge of the plaza towards the Casa de la Guerra, and again you see this kind of visual clutter, the numbers of cars, and of course the agapanthus again, and other structures that are more at ground level or eye level. And this issue of connectivity, the visual connectivity between the Casa de la Guerra. Here we're standing in the courtyard of the Casa, looking across De la Guerra Plaza towards the News Press building.
And then again, to go back to the plan, the existing conditions, De la Guerra Street, De la Guerra Street, the loop, the grass area itself, and the placita, and a visualization of the approach to dealing with the issues that was created this date, October 1st, showing the essentially the connections between State Street and the plaza area through Stork Placida. De la Guerra Street itself raised. The light buff color you see representing a uniform paved surface with no grade separation between roadway and plaza walking areas. This diagram also shows, so we can get into this in more detail later, potential for diagonal parking on the block of De la Guerra Street, and the reallocation of parking away from the loop to the two surrounding areas, and also extension of outdoor dining into both the plaza and the placita. A close-up view showing those elements. The addition of a water feature fronting on City Hall. The addition of canopy trees surrounding the outer perimeter of the plaza, and a pedestrian access way across from the current City Hall parking lot across the plaza. Again, an aerial view of the existing conditions from the southeast, showing the surrounding network of streets, parking lots. And in this slide, a visualization of the concept, showing the raised decorative paving along De la Guerra Street, the direct connection between the Casa de la Guerra itself through the plaza to the News Press building, and the cafe, actually the connection also from the City Hall parking lot to the east, and the cafe seating to the west with the water feature. Again, the context drawing showing State Street, Anacapa Street, and Santa Barbara Street, with diagonal parking also proposed for the block of De la Guerra between Anacapa and Santa Barbara Street.
And the removal of parking between the Casa de la Guerra and the plaza to visually open that connection. And also the trash enclosure along the City Hall parking lot for the businesses that front both on the plaza and on State Street.
Now, we would very briefly like to review the parking aspects, the parking reallocation aspects, which we can go into in more detail at a later point. But we'd like to invite Traffic Engineer Derek Rapp to the mic to go through the next 3 or 4 slides with you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Derek Rapp. I work with Penfield and Smith Engineers here in Santa Barbara. Obviously, one of the key operational issues of any kind of proposal like this is to determine what's going to happen with the parking that would be displaced. Currently, the concept is to create this plaza that would eliminate the existing parking in the plaza, of which there are approximately 35 spaces in that plaza loop. And I say approximately because there are no parking tees, so depending on the size of the vehicles, it could be plus or minus a space or two. But generally, it's about 35 spaces. So our task was to look at, well, if these spaces are displaced, where do we make up that parking? And we actually took our cues from another project that was done fairly recently, Granada Garage, and part of that discussion, or part of the mitigation for the elimination of those spaces, was the angled parking on Victoria Street, which actually turned out to be quite successful, and there were some rumblings that some people were interested in making those more permanent than temporary. So we took that concept and tried to apply that in this situation to see what we would get. This is a depiction of the 00 block east that would pick up about 2 spaces over what exists there today on the street. So we'd pick up a couple of spaces there with the angled parking, keeping the connectivity between the plaza and the Casa de la Guerra with the parking removal. And then we also looked at the next block over, which is the 100 East block, which would be between Anacapa and Santa Barbara, incorporating angled parking there. And we actually estimate we could pick up quite a few more spaces there, just because of the lack of existing parking on the street there due to red curbs and so forth. There we could pick up more, closer to on the order of 15 spaces. So we're talking about a total of maybe 17 spaces approximately. Take that away from 35, and you're somewhere in the upper teens to 20 spaces that you're still at a parking deficit there. So then we looked, and these are the breakdowns of the numbers that were provided to all the individuals that we gave this presentation to. You can see the existing parking is 35 spaces. We also looked at an inventory of the total area and came up with about a deficit of in the high teens. So we looked at where we could make up that parking space, and we looked at the City Hall lot as a potential for actually changing that City Hall lot to a more publicly operated lot, like a regular surface lot, in an effort to potentially recapture some of those spaces. So those are the things that we're currently looking at, and I think I'll turn it back over to Doug now.
Thank you, Derek. Returning to the diagram again, looking at the context between State Street, De La Guerra Street, and the plaza, surrounding buildings, the Casa, the City Hall, the News Press Building, and the cafes, and Stork Placida.
And so in this area, instead of car-dominated, it would be a pedestrian-dominant zone, essentially, in this area, with this raised paving.
Still providing through traffic on De La Guerra Street, and provision for access surrounding the plaza for emergency service vehicles, and flexibility of that nature. We'll now go through a series of bird's eye visualizations of the diagram, again, pre-design, pre-concept, simply showing how these elements work together. This is a view to the northeast, showing the cafe spaces opening onto the plaza, and the connection from Stork Placida, also showing the water feature.
And you can see the paved area at the bottom of the loop to accommodate the stage, the portable stages for festivals, etc. The lawn itself slopes from the Casa towards the News Press, of course, just as State Street slopes, and this is a gradual slope down and helps in viewing the stage.
As well as, we might add here, in addition to addressing the program in a general way, we're applying principles of sustainable design here, capture and retention and filtration of stormwater, for example, as well as providing them permeable surfaces where possible. And again, in this diagram even is preliminary to the diagram that showed the additional paving in the central area for pedestrian access. We'll move through these fairly quickly. This is a view down the west side showing, again, emphasizing the fact that there'll be no change of grade, no curb, so that the sidewalk dining extends into the plaza area, still with provision for access by vehicles down the length and through the length of the loop. This is another view showing from De La Guerra Street, from actually the City Hall balcony, looking down across the plaza, showing the water feature.
And in this case, you can see how the canopy trees along the perimeter would help shade the restaurant patios also, which, if you've ever been in them over the summertime or in early fall, become quite hot just because of the angle of the sun and how they receive sun for most of the day. And they now have a lot of umbrellas and shade structures, etc.
In addition, the project, the concept shows the additional dining in Stork Placida itself, and also specifically the establishment of a new connection between the so-called Caesars Alley right away to the southerly side, on the southerly side of Stork Placida, into Stork Placida itself, which provides direct access to the adjacent food service use. This diagram shows in color the addition of seating that's proposed, shown at this time, both in the Placida and the Plaza. Approximately 100 outdoor seats would be achieved through this configuration. Moving again to and recalling the lack of connectivity, if you will, between State Street and the Placida, of graphics and other visual cues. The current condition again, or the proposed potential condition again, showing seating and the link, direct link from the Placida to the Caesars Alley area. Again, another bird's eye showing this configuration. View from the corner of the Weston Building, looking southeasterly on De La Guerra Street to the City Hall and the water feature beyond.
So that the water feature or a feature, a landscape feature, would offer an eye catcher along State Street to help bring people, encourage people to come into the plaza. Of course, a fountain with its moving water is an animating feature to any exterior space.
And we'll review again the last 2 or 3 slides here, which clearly we'll be able to go back to as required. But again, the bird's eye condition looking northwesterly, showing the Casa de la Guerra Street, the loop, the plaza area, the News Press, the City Hall parking lot.
And in this case, you can see the shade structures and umbrellas that I was talking about earlier.
And this again, the diagram condition showing the raised paving on De La Guerra Street, the connection between across from Casa de la Guerra across into the plaza, the water feature. The diagram again at this scale. The diagram in the context of the pedestrian linkages downtown.
one piece we have not mentioned is the improved lighting. It doesn't really show on our drawings at this point, but improved lighting throughout the plaza for security in the evenings, but also to create a more welcoming, inviting presence for pedestrian activity, whether it's little twinkle lights in the trees or bollard lighting for to light the pedestrian surface, etc.
And again, existing conditions have informed this response to the program, as well as the tradition and the history of designs. This is a visualization of the 1924 design, which I believe you have represented in plan view in your packet. Very interesting to see the bollards and chains, the separation between the plaza and the De La Guerra Street, and the aspect of the earliest visualizations of the 1853 intent of De La Guerra Plaza. And with that, I think we have just this view again reminding us of the singular importance of this place in the city. And here a history of the presentations that have been given, this presentation, over the past several months in September. And I think if Mark has some closing words, I think that concludes our formal part of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. A brief wrap-up, and thank you, Doug and Regula and Derek. There are quite a number of elements here for the Commission to consider. And at this point, because we are simply attempting to craft a starting point for the design and environmental review processes, the design is very pliable. There's nothing hard. Some of these elements may or may not make it into the project description, and even then they may evolve further once the design and environmental review processes proceed. Therefore, we expect that as more information becomes available with the identification of constraints and opportunities, the design will evolve much further. We thank you for your help today.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the applicant by the Commission at this time? Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Myers. I have a question for the applicant. One of the challenges of this project is to create a really useful civic plaza and park out of this site. In our city's master plan, it talks about the difference between a paseo and an alleyway. And a paseo or a plaza is a place that's dominated by pedestrians, and not to be confused with an alley, which is dominated by cars. And somehow we've turned our great civic plaza into an alley, and now we're trying to repair it. And one of the challenges is to instill a sense of liveliness into the plaza. And the question I have, in your experience with other similar kinds of projects, have you seen any use of free Wi-Fi or creation of outdoor internet cafe type spaces that would attract people to our plaza? Kiosks that sell coffee and so on.
Yes.
And how would the electricity for that work?
Well, yes, there's plenty of power there. In that there will be in that loop to service also the booths for Fiesta and the sound booth, etc. And we had, if you notice around the, and of course these are all diagrams that you're looking at. This is not a finalized design. I know other issues of details have come up in the past. But if you notice, we show tables and chairs also around the fountain with a possibility of the plaza being a Wi-Fi area. We have looked at these, studied these types of park installations in various places around the world. Actually, in Paris, it's very successful. In San Francisco, very successful. There are actually Wi-Fi groups that get together, kind of laptop groups that get together and have lunch together. And we think it would be a wonderful addition to the use of the plaza and enlivening it.
Okay, great. And my second question is, why did we keep the lawn? Because often in the city we're looking to get rid of lawns. They are difficult to maintain and seed. They use a lot of water. How did that happen?
Well, we proceeded with this looking at the least amount of significant changes to the existing plaza. We know there's sense in the community, in the public, of some feeling for the lawn. We used it mainly as a placeholder to express in some visual way the usable space at the center of the plaza. If we remove parking, we're able to extend the width of that usable space down the center of the plaza with this promenade around the outside. So that's why I asked you to look at the existing curb line as designated by those the palm trees and the line of the lamppost, because we were able to widen the central portion of the plaza. But what that surface is, whether it's lawn or paving, is not really part of this diagram, just a kind of placeholder.
So it could be permeable paving
Of course,
without
yes.
any difficulty. And just for the record, I did have an ex parte conversation with Doug about this and asked about the electrical, so I've just asked that same question again. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, as I understand it, this redesign has been going on for 3+ years. Doug or Heather, I don't know who. Is this that we're seeing today the product of that subcommittee that's been going on for 3+ years? Are we looking at a subcommittee submittal?
I think this is actually Mark Aguilar's response.
Mark, if you'd like to just go ahead and step up to this podium, it might be easier for everyone.
Actually, that's twice I've done that now. What you're seeing before you today is, yes and no, it is a product of this process. The process began with a subcommittee of representatives of commissioners, committee members, the local businesses. They were essentially advising us at that early on from I guess 2005 up to about end of 06. At the end of 06, that's when we returned to council and asked them for some prioritization on a lot of the elements that had some interplay. At that point, they asked staff not to approach it as a fix-it and to-do-it list item by item, but rather have Campbell & Campbell return with a more comprehensive design, really come back with, well, what should this be really, instead of just trying to do fix-it. So that was a change in course, and so to answer your question specifically, probably no, this isn't what came out of that subcommittee design, but yes, this is part of that process.
And let me also reiterate, if I may, not to digress, if I'm not out of order, the work that has been done, the extensive work that's been done in terms of presentations at meetings since September is not incorporated into the diagrammatic presentation and discussion of the issues that you saw. That has been a significant process, as many people who are here today would attest, who participated and whose input we're extremely looking forward to incorporating into the next stage of analysis.
Okay, different question. On page 4 of our staff report, there's a map, vicinity map, and it identifies the project site. However, I see an awful lot of changes being proposed in this project along De La Guerra Street. And would that not then be part of the project site for any environmental review going forward?
Chair Myers and planning commissioners, yes, I believe that it would be included. Just as a default, we choose the parcel. And so what you're seeing on the staff report is the parcel at hand.
Well, it's more than the parcel. It includes the entire city hall. It includes Stork Placida.
Which is all part of the same parcel. Except for Stork Placida, I think.
So we
Okay.
could revise.
But the
when we
project
come back
is,
since it's-
you're proposing to make significant changes
Yes.
to Delegara Street, which
And that is,
would be
and
part of the,
if that's what council decides in response to the comments from all the various meetings that have been held to proceed with, then that will be considered as part of the environmental review.
okay. Also in the staff report, page 5 is a parking study of numbers. And what's the catchment area that those 600 and plus numbers entail? And it looks like there's some double counting in there, but,
I think that will be covered as part of the staff presentation.
oh, I thought we had the staff.
No, that was the applicant presentation.
Oh. Okay. Then I'll hold my questions until, I thought we had the whole presentation. Sorry.
Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This area, along with much of the downtown, was the subject of a fairly significant redevelopment effort in the mid-'70s. I think Lyle Stewart put together a schematic of the downtown and how pedestrian activity went about. The redevelopment agency amended its redevelopment plan and adopted a project area map. And I was just curious, to what degree did those kind of historical approaches to urban revitalization influence or inform your current plan, and did those come into account when you went through the historical record?
The short answer is yes, specifically with respect to addressing pedestrian connectivity and character of the what has become presently the aspiration of the city's pedestrian linkages plan, plazas, paseos, and so forth. But we are looking forward to detailed analysis and exposition of all those historic, from 1924 and actually before, onward, in the next phase of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. I have a few questions, maybe after the staff presentation, most of them, but one of them is regards to bollards and how those bollards might, what is the intent of using the paseo, the hardscape paseo for vehicles? Are they delivery vehicles or just emergency vehicles, and how would those bollards influence that?
Yes, the use of bollards, which is traditional in other parts of the world, has become much more widespread in this country and locally in recent years as a way to provide safe adjacency of pedestrians and vehicles while maintaining a uniform surface and eliminating curbs. If drainage can be accommodated through swales and current technology, the bollard is a very good way to separate people and cars. Now, also along with this, technology has been developed to provide for the almost immediate lowering of bollards. As you know, there are electronic means having to do with security concerns as well as practical issues related to service access and so forth. The diagram that you saw shows a configuration of infrastructure elements. It attempts to show them in a way that would provide for flexible management. In other words, bollards, as even shown in the 1924 rendition, closing off the service road loop from Delegara Street, are removable. In that case, they use removable chains, but we can foresee the use of bollards that would come up and down as the management of the area changed from service, emergency, limited access, et cetera, et cetera.
And, well, of course, the bollards can also be used for walkway lighting. But to answer your question about the service requirements, yes, there's also a service requirement for trash collection of those businesses whose trash is located. It's towards Stearns Wharf along State Street. and down from Blenders, they include Blenders, down to the next street. There's an alley behind those, little alleyway, walkway, behind those businesses whose trash is then brought out into De La Guerra Plaza to be picked up. And that's part of the use of that Caesar's Alley that runs right on the north side of the existing Blenders building, between Blenders and Stork Placida, if I'm making myself clear. I hope there's a kind. It's about a 1.5 foot grade change between the level of Stork Placida and that little Caesar's Alley. That's why we proposed adding just 3 risers in there, which could graciously be added to that planting edge between Stork Placida and Blender and Caesar's Alley now. And there's just some little pygmy date palms that could be relocated. So.
Again, a preliminary response, but generally the bollards are used and thought of as a flexible management tool.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no more questions from the commission. Staff have a presentation. Ms. Baker?
Okay, I was just trying to get that picture up of the Placida for you, but we're moving on. So. Okay, so staff's presentation is focused on just reviewing the project statistics a little bit more in detail for the project and going over what the review process would be for this, potentially, and the design review, historic resources, portion of the review as well, which is Historic Landmarks Commission, and then review by other committees. They reference that. I've got the same list in my presentation. And then the general plan consistency is the bulk of my presentation. And then we have a list of elements of the project for the Planning Commission's consideration. So this is a zoning map of the project. The green, the actual part of the plaza is PR, Park and Recreation Zone. And then the rest is a C2 that you're seeing in the red, which is a commercial zoning. And not too far away is some commercial manufacturing off to the right. And as you can see, I did get the project site completely, including the De La Guerra Street on this one at least. So, okay, so as far as the potential review requirements, of course, it's going to depend quite a bit on what the actual project is determined to be. And so the first step is a city council hearing to determine the project scope. Again, everything that's before you today is just potential options for discussion at a very conceptual pre-project level. But the first step will be the city council to take all the feedback from your commission and all the other hearing bodies and decide on a project scope. Next would be a historic structures report for the Historic Landmarks Commission, and then the Historic Landmarks Commission can begin their formal review. I've highlighted the 2 parts that pertain to the Planning Commission, so the draft environmental impact report will be coming back to you the next time that you see this project, would be the idea. Or excuse me, the scoping hearing. And that would be a joint meeting most likely with Historic Landmarks Commission. Of course, whether or not an EIR is required will depend on the project scope. If it's just a very light hand as to what's being done, say just the electrical tent is being moved, it may be that we don't necessarily need the entire EIR. But if it is the full type of project, then we would definitely need a full EIR with different aspects being reviewed. So there would be the public review and comment, of course. Then the final environmental impact report certification would come back to you. Our city attorney wanted us to emphasize that this would need to happen before any council funding would occur for a potential project. And then preliminary and final reviews would happen by the Historic Landmarks Commission, followed up by eventually the building permit and project construction. So it's quite a long process. We're basically at step 0 right now, okay? The project statistics, just for the park space itself, is 15,500 square feet about, and the lot is almost 100,000 square feet. So the idea is that if some of the parking area is changed into dining, that would then become the park space, so the park space could actually be expanded as part of the lot makeup. The electrical tent is about 9 feet tall. That location is proposed to change. and the parking, of course, could potentially change. So this is a summary of the statistics that I was provided. The Plaza Loop would lose 35 spaces potentially if the full concepts were taken forward. De La Guerra Street looks like 16 more spaces could fit. I heard in the presentation today perhaps 17 spaces could fit on De La Guerra Street. City Hall lot, the idea was that 7 to 10 of those spaces might be able to be set aside for public parking full-time. And so that would be a net change of 9 to 12 spaces, which might sound like a lot if you're only thinking of the 35 spaces in the plaza. But I think it's important that you look at the surrounding area as well as far as available parking. So, for example, now on De La Guerra Street, there's 43 spaces, and the applicant would have the exact extent of De La Guerra that's counted in these spaces. But it could go up to 59 if it were made one way and the diagonal parking were implemented. And so just adding up here, then if you look at Anacapa Street as well, that is existing 42 spaces, which would not change. That would create 101. And then with the city parking lot number 10, as you can see, it's less than a block away from De La Guerra Plaza. So, and those 546 public parking spaces, when added to the others, would make 647. And then those 7 to 10 spaces discussed for the City Hall lot, which might turn into public spaces all around the clock, would also add this being up to 654 to 657. Again, there's also semi-public spaces here. People can park here in the evenings or on the weekends in the city lot. So the idea is that the existing spaces, to answer the question earlier, the 666, that would be the vicinity. It would just be De La Guerra, Anacapa, this parking lot, garage, and potential conversion of those. The 666 does not include the off-hours ones. That's because they're only off-hours. I'm just looking at full-time spaces. Okay, so are there any questions on the parking statistics before we move on, or just since I've got it up?
Any questions from the Commission? Mr. Thompson? Nope. Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On De La Guerra Street between Anacapa and Santa Barbara, if you come down Anacapa, make a left turn onto De La Guerra, now you have no parking because the parking stalls are all angled the wrong way? Is that how we're reading this? I mean, all the stalls are, you can only park there if you're heading west. If you're heading east, there's nothing available.
My understanding is that the direction that De La Guerra, for the proposal, hasn't been decided. That it's just a conceptual idea. It could be either headed towards State Street or headed away from State Street. A lot more discussion would need to happen to decide.
And then what happens on the other block of De La Guerra between State Street and Anacapa being one way if, according to the news press articles, we opt to not have cars on State Street?
I'm not sure I've heard it.
Well, it's a one-way street heading towards State Street that may not have cars in the future. There's no place for it to have an outlet.
The possibility of closing State Street to traffic is not being, that's not part of this project consideration.
No, I know. But we are planning for the future rather than, right. Okay.
That's, I think that one's a little bit speculative at this point.
Okay.
I also received a request from a commissioner to look at, and I know this is a little bit fuzzy, to look at other lots in the area. So this is obviously the plaza here. There's lot 10, which is the 546 spaces. But you could also consider, yes, there is another garage that's about a block away here for Paseo Nuevo, and lot parking garage number 9 and number 2. There's quite a bit of parking in the vicinity. So just for your reference. And I also provided the commission with the listing of how many spaces are in each of those lots.
Heather, I have a question, a follow-up question to Mr. Bartlett's question about the easterly direction of De La Guerra and being able to maneuver to park into a 45-degree angle that's counterintuitive to that direction. I assume that traffic's looked at this and that it's not impossible to make that maneuver.
I think that's accurate, and it would certainly be the subject of further environmental review.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that concludes the project statistics part of the presentation, and now for the design review process. Historic Landmarks Commission review took place on October, just again, a conceptual options discussion. They gave positive comments, generally is what the minutes reflect. We do have the chair, Bill Lavoie, we have Bill Lavoie here today to provide some more comment for the commission. And they did request, of course, historic analysis, which will be integral to this process if it depending on which components are included. And the HLC also wants to consider this book, the Plaza de la Guerra Reconsidered document, as part of the review as they go forward. The historic resources that are at the plaza is noteworthy structure of importance per the conservation element. And then adjacent landmarks are City Hall, the Pepper Tree, Casa de la Guerra, El Paseo. Casa de la Guerra is also a state landmark. And then there's the potential for a landmarking of the News Press building at some point. The El Pueblo Viejo design guidelines will be integral to the Historic Landmarks Commission's review of any changes. Anything that's an exterior change, any type of infrastructure change would need to be in the Spanish style consistent with those guidelines. So you can see some of the things that are listed on the slide that would need to be consistent with the guidelines. Also, the EPV guidelines do note that the City Hall arcade is notable. So any changes that might affect the aesthetic quality of the City Hall arcade would need to be considered carefully. For example, if the electrical tent is moved to be close to the arcade, the effect of that would need to be considered. Okay, so with the urban design guidelines, there's a couple that come into play here, specifically guideline number 5. Commissioner Jacobs mentioned the plaza versus the paseo concept. And there is a thought in the urban design guidelines that plazas are spaces where activities take place away from pedestrian activities, and paseos, on the other hand, are designed to provide pedestrian connections between destinations. So then the question becomes, what level of pedestrian connectivity through the plaza is appropriate? Conceptually, we have a path going across the plaza presented, and the amount of hardscaping that we've considered to make it easier to traverse the plaza, et cetera. So could there be dual purposes of both a gathering space and pedestrian connections, and what level of each is appropriate is a question as this would be reviewed. Other aspects of the urban design guidelines, they suggest decorative paving. I think that's going to be a component of this project, and the details, we'll talk about that more, I'm sure, as the project evolves. And the focal point as a water element, with the fountain being provided, that would be consistent with these guidelines. And the only area where I thought maybe perhaps sunny and shaded seating areas, having a great variety of those or more of those, the suggestion was through trees or traditional Mediterranean elements such as arcades in the guidelines that may be further developed, I would guess, as a scope is moving forward. The urban design guidelines also talk about some other aspects as well, lighting, landscaping, security, and drainage. There's also a guideline regarding bicycle parking. This is pictures of the existing bicycle parking conditions by City Hall. There is no curb cut directly adjacent to the existing bicycle parking. Obviously, if it's all the same level, that would be changed, but the suggestion in the guidelines is for the parking to be near plaza entrances rather than in the middle of plazas for obvious transportation efficiency. This substandard rack type would be changed to the updated types. As far as the entrances, this is an entrance from the parking lot, and that's where the current bike rack is located. Looking at some of the other entrances as possible bicycle locations, you can see here's some edges of the plaza. Here's another edge. There might not be as much space over here, but if the whole thing had raised paving, there might be more opportunities for different bicycle parking near plaza entrances. Okay, for guideline number 9, the tent location being moved would definitely be consistent with this guideline because it suggests that electrical equipment and services should not be focal points in the El Pueblo Viejo district, that they should be unobtrusive as possible. So As you can see, that if someone's looking at this monument here, the tent is quite focal, and so moving it to this location next to the city hall or somewhere else to the periphery of the site would definitely be an improvement for consistency with the guideline. Okay, the other equipment issue would then be the trash and where that's kept currently. Presentation altogether, or is more? So I just feel like I should. If there's so many people waiting to speak, if you don't mind, I can continue. But if you really can't hear and have the noise at the same time, I'm willing to stop as well. You want me to speak louder than the buzzing?
Yeah, I think we're okay. Why don't we take a quick break after? Does this help here? No. Okay. Why don't we take a quick break after your presentation if it's not fixed?
All right.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Make it 10.
Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it hurts.